When it comes to collecting video games, there's one type of game that gamers typically have a negative association with, and that would be sports games. Now, not every single gamer hates every single sports game, but what it comes down to is this. When we play video games, oftentimes the appeal is that we're getting to go to these fictional worlds, these fictional places with these really cool made-up characters, and we're getting to do something that doesn't have to do with real life, and that's what makes it cool. But with sports games, they're basically trying to mimic something in real life, so that can be off-putting for a lot of people who play video games. Funny enough, the sports games that we like the most tend to be ones that are the least realistic. I mean, just think if in basketball you could jump 100 feet into the air before you slam dunked the ball through the basket, and then maybe the backboard could break or the ball could light on fire. That's NBA Jam for you. The other problem is that the more realistic you try to make a sports game, the more quickly it can become irrelevant, because each year, in theory, as technology gets better, you can make the game feel more and more realistic, therefore outdoing what was done the year before and making it obsolete. And so the more unrealistic and more arcade-like you make a game gives it a better chance of aging well, because you're not focusing on trying to make it more realistic and depending on that for the enjoyment of the player. For example, with NBA Jam, it's incredibly unrealistic, but they focused on making it really fun, and they kind of maxed out how fun a arcade basketball game can be. So in that way, it's always going to be enjoyable to play, and that's why so many people still remember NBA Jam and want to play it all these years later, and probably for a lot of years to come too. Another problem with the sports games that try to be more realistic is that they're annualized, which just really rubs gamers the wrong way, whether it's sports games or not. And the reason why is that it feels kind of lazy, like, okay, we're just going to make minimal changes to this game and then push it out again the next year and charge full price. That just feels very anti-consumer. So what you're left with is a situation where, say you have Madden 2003, and then there's also Madden 2002. Well, why on earth would you want to play Madden 2002 instead of 2003? Even though it's almost the same game, Madden 2003 is a little bit better. So who's going to go back and buy Madden 2002? And to make it even worse, these games sold really well at the time because they're popular, NFL football games. And so there's a ton of copies of Madden 2002 sitting out there, but nobody wants them. So therefore, their value is basically non-existent. They're the lowest value games you can find. There actually are some annualized sports games that are considered rare and valuable. For example, there's one on the GameCube. I think it's called College Basketball 2K3 or something like that. If Console Collector is watching, he'll be sure to put that down in the comments. He'll definitely know what that is. But anyways, there are some rare instances where these games receive very limited print runs for some odd reason or another, but the general overall rule is that these games sell really well at the time of release. There's tons of copies out there and they're just considered obsolete now and nobody wants them. Let me tell a quick little story that I bet almost every single one of you watching has experienced at some point. This is just a rite of passage for any collector. Okay, so you're looking for games somewhere, whether it be a flea market or a yard sale or thrift store or maybe even just on eBay. And in the distance, you see that familiar silhouette of whatever the cartridge or game case looks like for the type of game that you're looking for. And so immediately you get kind of excited. You're like, ooh, like there's games over there. So you go over there and then you go through it and it's just a bunch of old worthless sports titles and you go, damn it. And that sinking feeling of disappointment is when you know you've been welcomed to the world of collecting. And what's funny about it too is you're probably not the first person to look at those exact same set of sports games and feel that disappointment. Somebody else was probably there already and felt that disappointment, and that's why they're still there and will continue to be there for a long time because the demand is almost non-existent for some of these games. However, they are not all worthless, so you may want to double check the value of them just to be sure. And actually, you can even benefit from this because a lot of times sellers will just look at any old sports game and automatically assume that it's worthless. For example, I got NHL 94 for $1. Now, this is one of the most iconic retro sports games there is, and sure, it's really not that valuable. I think at the time I bought it, its true value was maybe $10 or $15. But for $1, that's pretty awesome, and it's one of the best sports games ever made. Now, while we're talking about NHL 94, I want to bring up another point, because you could look at NHL 94 and say, hey, wait a second, that was an annualized sports series, so why is that so different? Well, one thing some retro games had going for them is that because they were older and very limited by technology, they could only be so realistic, which forced developers to make the gameplay more arcade-like. And so, funny enough, that allowed the games to age better. So NHL 94 is incredibly unrealistic, very arcade-like, and still super fun to play to this day. Hence why there's still a website, NHL94.com, where people play the game online competitively to this day because it's that fun of a game. And of course, this argument could be applied to just video games in general, that the more realistic you try to make a video game, the worse its chances are of aging well. And the more unrealistic you make a video game, the better its chances of aging are, because it will always have that timeless fun factor that was maxed out at the time it was made. I think it could also be argued that the more arcade-like sports games are more creative and more of an art form than the more realistic sports games. And the reason for this is that when you're trying to make a sports game as realistic as possible, you're basically just trying to copy real life, and that's not very creative, is it? But when you're coming up with an arcade game, it requires a lot of creativity because you're trying to differentiate your game from what the real life counterpart looks like. And there's way more possibilities as a result, because you can come up with all kinds of wacky stuff. The limits of reality are no longer there, so you are left unchecked to come up with all this crazy, wacky stuff and just focus on what would make it fun to play. Alright, now before I wrap things up, I want to quickly bring up that I've always found it funny that it gets brought up almost as a disclaimer how many bad sports games are in somebody's collection. Like, if someone has a ton of games, they're always like, and I swear there's not a lot of bad sports games in here, there's not a bunch of filler. And when someone sees a large collection, they go, wait a second, do you just have a bunch of old crappy sports games in there? Because the thing is, if you wanted to really bulk up your collection, you could just go and buy 1,000,000 old crappy sports games and it would look like you have a ton of games. But then when you look closer, you go, wait a second, these aren't actually good games. Alright, so there you have my thoughts on sports games. Of course, I want to hear what all of your thoughts are when it comes to sports games. And specifically, I would like to hear any stories you have related to frustration that you've experienced when it comes to collecting and running across these sports games, because that kind of stuff is always really fun to hear. So be sure to leave those comments down below as always, and I will see ya in the next video.